I've always celebrated July 4th with my family, but this year I wanted to do something different. My friend Mark and I decided to explore an abandoned factory just outside of our town. The locals called it the Firework Factory. That's because 20 years ago, some kids played around with fireworks near the factory and ended up burning the place down. Sadly, there were some workers who died inside it too. The town never rebuilt it or tore it down. They just wanted to forget about it and move on. Now it sits locked away on the side of the road, never to be touched again. No one has gone inside it for over 10 years, so my friend and I thought it would be cool to explore it on its 20th anniversary. We've heard stories about people seeing ghosts there, seeing the ghosts of the people that died. I don't believe in ghosts, but I'm definitely excited to see what we find there. It was about 7 at night when we arrived at the factory. The factory's walls were charred from bottom to top. Paint seemed to be chipping off it, and there were several doors that looked melted. It was hard to imagine this place bustling with workers. Now it was lifeless, a place of whispers and shadows. We pushed open the creaking gate and stepped inside, the air heavy with the smell of burnt wood and rusting metal. The place was a maze of collapsed beams and twisted metal, the floor covered in dust and mold. As we moved deeper into the factory, the light from the setting sun barely reached us, plunging us into an eerie twilight. "Man, this place gives me the creeps," Mark said, his voice echoing off the walls. I nodded, feeling a shiver run down my spine. "Let's just be careful. I don't want to end up on the news as one of those idiots who got trapped in a condemned building." We moved cautiously, our flashlights casting long, wavering beams of light that made the shadows dance. The further we went, the darker it got. The silence was almost eerie, broken only by the occasional creak of settling wood or the distant drip of water. We turned a corner and found ourselves on the main production floor. The remnants of machinery loomed out of the darkness like ancient, rusting dinosaurs. Our footsteps echoed, making it feel like we were not alone. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching us from the shadows. Then I heard something. It came from the back of the room. It was the sound of voices. "Did you hear that?" I asked. "No. What did you hear?" Mark asked. I scanned the room and replied, "I heard whispering." He laughed nervously and said, "It's probably just the wind. This place is full of holes and cracks. Let's keep moving." We continued walking, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread I felt. My friend walked into the room in front of us, but I was a couple steps behind him trying to catch up. Then the whispering came back, but it was louder this time. I spun around and looked down the hallway. I froze and my eyes widened. There was a shadow at the end of the hallway, a figure standing perfectly still, watching me. "Hello?" I called out to the person, but there was no response. I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman. There were no distinguishable features on it, but I was too far away to see. It didn't move. It didn't even look like it was breathing. I was starting to feel uneasy. Mark walked back into the hallway and asked, "Who are you talking to?" He followed my gaze and gasped. We stood there in silence for a couple of seconds, both staring at the figure. I could feel my pulse rising. Then a giant popping sound filled the air. My friend and I looked at the window to my left and saw fireworks going off outside. When we looked back down the hallway, the person was gone. "Where did it go?" I asked. "I don't know, but let's get out of here before we see someone else," Mark said, his voice trembling. We turned to leave, trying to retrace our steps, but all the rooms looked the same. I don't remember where we came from. Panic set in as we realized we were lost. We rounded a corner and found ourselves in what must have been the break room. Old, moldy furniture was scattered about, and the smell of decay was overwhelming. And then I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. There was another person in here, standing in the corner of the room. Unlike the other person, this one was walking towards us. Mark grabbed my arm and pulled me out of the room. "Run!" he screamed at me. We ran blindly through the factory. I could hear noises and whispers behind us, but I didn't dare look back. We reached the front door and burst through it. We didn't stop running until we reached the safety of our car, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. And as we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching us. I'll never forget that experience, but I try to stay as far away from that factory as possible now. Every year on the 4th of July, I visit my dad's grave. It had become a tradition, a way to honor him on a day when the country celebrated its independence. He was a soldier and a patriot who loved his country as much as he loved his family. 5 years ago, he passed away, and I had made it a point to visit him every year since. This year was no different, or so I thought. The cemetery was quiet, as usual. The sun had set, and the sky was lit up with fireworks in the distance. The pops and crackles of the fireworks filled the air. I walked down the familiar path, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, illuminating the gravestones as I passed. As I approached my dad's grave, I felt the familiar wave of sadness and nostalgia wash over me. I knelt down and placed a small bouquet of flowers on his headstone, tracing the letters of his name with my fingers. "Miss you, Dad," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the distant explosions of the fireworks. I leaned against his grave and opened a beer, thinking about all the memories we had together. I sat there for a while, lost in my thoughts, when a sudden, piercing scream shattered the silence. My heart skipped a beat and I stood up looking around frantically. The scream had come from somewhere deeper in the cemetery. I hesitated, unsure whether to investigate or to leave and call for help. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to see what was going on. I walked cautiously, my flashlight flickering as I moved deeper into the cemetery. The scream scared me. It sounded sinister and angry. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. As I rounded a corner, I saw a deranged man with wild eyes, swinging a hammer at the gravestones. He was shouting loudly, not making any sense. His voice was a mix of anger and madness. The man was covered in dirt. He looked like he hadn't showered in weeks. There were pieces of gravestones scattered all around him. He dropped his hammer and picked up a shovel from the ground. The man started digging up the grave in front of him. He was laughing crazily and talking to the gravestone as if he were having a conversation. I didn't understand why he was doing this, but I had to make sure he didn't see me. I ducked behind a large tree, my heart pounding in my chest. I needed to call the police, but I didn't want to draw the man's attention. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911, keeping my voice low as I explained the situation. "There's a man in the cemetery. He's destroying gravestones and digging up graves. Please hurry," I whispered urgently. The operator assured me that help was on the way, but I was on my own for now. I turned my flashlight off and I tried to stay as quiet as possible. But as I took a step back, I stepped on a twig, the loud snap echoing through the night. The deranged man stopped what he was doing and snapped his head in my direction. Panic surged through me, and I pressed myself against the tree, praying that he hadn't seen me. I held my breath, my heart hammering in my chest as I listened to his footsteps approaching. He was getting closer, and I knew I had to move. I slowly edged around the tree, trying to stay out of sight. The footsteps stopped, and I risked a glance around the trunk. The man was standing a few feet away, looking around suspiciously. He hadn't seen me, but he was on high alert. "I know someone's here," the man said in a disturbing voice. He smiled creepily and spoke again. "My friend over here is lonely. He's looking for someone to join him, so come on out." This guy was insane. I had to get out of here. I took a deep breath and crept away, keeping low to the ground. My flashlight was off, and I navigated by the dim light of the moon and the occasional burst of fireworks. I was 2 trees away from the man and thought I was safe. But then, my phone began ringing. I quickly clicked it off and looked up. The deranged man was running at me. I was panicking now and sprinted toward the entrance of the cemetery. "Help!" I shouted frantically. But there was no one else around. I could hear him catching up behind me. Even though he destroyed a lot of gravestones, He had enough energy to chase after me. Relief washed over me as I saw the flashing blue lights of a police car at the entrance of the cemetery. "Help me!" I shouted at the officers. Both of them sprinted my way. One of the officers pulled out a weapon and tased the man behind me. The man fell to the ground, right next to my feet. Everything else was a blur to me after that, but I was so thankful those officers showed up when they did. This didn't stop me from seeing my dad every year, but I made sure to visit him during the day. I'll never risk going back to a cemetery at night again. Every 4th of July, my mom, dad, and I traveled to our cabin nestled deep in the woods. It was a tradition we all loved, filled with fishing, hiking, and roasting marshmallows over the fire. But this year didn't go as expected. As we finally turned down the gravel road leading to our cabin, I could see the familiar outline of our wooden house standing tall against the backdrop of the dense forest. My dad slowed the car to a stop and stepped out, stretching his legs. I hopped out of the car, feeling the crunch of the gravel under my sneakers. The air smelled of pine and earth, a scent I associated with summer and freedom. We grabbed our bags and walked up to the front porch. But as we approached the door, my dad's cheerful demeanor changed. "Stay here," he instructed. He reached for the door handle and turned it slowly. The door swung open with an eerie creak. Dad's face tightened and he signaled for us to stay back. As he stepped inside, my mom and I exchanged worried glances. "You can come in now," he said, though his voice lacked its usual warmth. Mom and I stepped inside, and I immediately noticed the mess. Clothes were strewn everywhere, and the trash can was overflowing with discarded food wrappers and half-eaten meals. It looked like someone had been living here. My heart pounded in my chest, and I instinctively moved closer to my mom. "Looks like someone broke in. Probably some drifter," my dad said, inspecting the living room. "But why would they leave everything like this?" my mom asked, her voice shaky. "I don't know, but they're not here now. Let's clean up and try to enjoy our time." "I'll call the sheriff in the morning," my dad said. We spent the next few hours tidying up the cabin. My parents checked every room to make sure no one was hiding. They found nothing out of the ordinary, just more mess. By the time we finished, the sun was setting and we could hear the fireworks from the town nearby. We sat down for dinner, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling that hung in the air. Dad made his famous spaghetti, and we talked about the hikes we would take and the fish we hoped to catch. For a moment, things felt normal. After dinner, I offered to put away the dishes. As I stood at the sink, I glanced out the kitchen window and froze. A man stood just outside staring at me. His face was tilted, eyes sunken, and he wore tattered clothes. Panic surged through me and I screamed. They rushed into the kitchen. "What's wrong?" my mom asked. "There's someone outside," I said while pointing out the window. My dad opened the back door and searched the area, but there was no sign of the man. "There's no one there," my dad said as he walked back into the cabin. My parents went back to the couch unbothered, but I knew what I saw. There was someone here. They were just hiding. An hour passed and we tried to settle down, but I still felt anxious. Just as we were beginning to relax, a loud knock echoed through the cabin. We all jumped, and my dad got up to answer the door. He opened it cautiously, but no one was there again. Then, from the back door, we heard the doorknob rattling as if someone was trying to get in. My dad grabbed the baseball bat he kept by the door and shouted, "Whoever you are, you'd better stop. I'm armed." The rattling stopped, but the silence that followed was even more terrifying. My dad ran into his bedroom and came out with a pistol. A few minutes later, a rock crashed through the living room window, shattering glass everywhere. As I hid behind the couch, my dad then ran to the front door and disappeared into the darkness. My mom and I stood still, looking at the wide open front door. We heard rustling outside but didn't know who it was. Footsteps approached the entrance, and in came the man I saw through the window. His eyes were wide and looked very red. His hair was disheveled and I could smell alcohol coming from him. The most disturbing part was that he was holding a knife. My mom stood in front of me, shielding me from the man. "Bill," my mom called out to my dad with an urgent tone. The man took a few steps closer to us, but was startled when he heard gunshots behind him. The man immediately ran out of the house. A few seconds later, my dad showed up, breathing heavily. "You guys okay?" he asked. My mom and I were crying but nodded our heads. My dad then turned back towards the front door and fired a shot into the darkness. "Get out of here. If you come any closer, I won't miss next time," he shouted into the forest, hoping the man heard his warning. We quickly closed the door and started blocking the window that was broken. The night fell silent, but we were all tense and afraid. There were no more rocks thrown, and no more knocks came. Eventually, exhausted and on edge, we tried to get some sleep, but it was a restless night for all of us. The next morning, we packed up and left the cabin. Dad said he would call the sheriff and report what had happened. My family decided to sell the cabin, and I was glad we didn't have to go back there. It was now tainted by fear and uncertainty. I didn't know who the man was or why he had targeted us, but I knew one thing for sure. I would never forget that 4th of July.